Recently, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met with US President-elect Donald Trump, and the former effectively laid out an ultimatum. Either NATO admits Ukraine into the alliance, or Ukraine will build nuclear weapons. In essence, the appeal Zelensky is making is that one or the other is necessary to enforce the terms of a settlement that might end the war in Ukraine. But this raises a whole lot of questions. Is Ukrainian membership in NATO plausible? Is Ukraine developing nuclear weapons plausible? How would Ukraine go about trying to build one? What would be the international response to that? And is NATO or nukes a false dichotomy? Oh, and why is Richard Nixon going to be showing up later? Well, we are not going to waste any time today, because these are all essentially lines on maps questions. The NATO versus nukes dichotomy is effectively an open discussion of how Ukraine wants to settle on terms that are not inherently self-enforcing. You see, in a vacuum, wars tend to end when there is mutual recognition of what the expected outcome would be, should the sides fight to a military conclusion. They then settle on terms roughly equivalent to that expectation. What makes those terms enforceable is the military power that both sides retain. If someday one of the parties would revert back to fighting, then the outcome returns to the military expectation. But remember, the deal itself is close to that by design, and devolving back to war brings cost to each side, perhaps represented by the lost territory pushing on either country's value of the stakes. What falls between the red and yellow lines are settlements that would be self-enforcing. Consequently, if Ukraine believes that it needs something like NATO, or nuclear weapons to enforce an agreement, then it tells us something about the deal that it anticipates putting onto paper. One possibility is that it aspirationally envisions a settlement outside of the scope of the previously drawn bargaining range. That range moves with the balance of power, so add more power to Ukraine's column, and the range shifts into a region that Ukraine might seek. Option 2 is that the Kremlin is going to still think that it can do better than what the settlement will give Russia, and so something needs to happen to shut down that belief. Option 3 is that Ukraine anticipates that Russia will be able to reload faster than Ukraine will be able to, post-war. To be clear, the relevant metric is not that Russia has a general ability to regenerate faster than Ukraine. That would already be built into the expected war outcome. After all, general regeneration capacity matters for what happens if the war continues to a military outcome. Rather, it is that specifically stopping the war will change those rebuilding rates in a manner relatively more favorable to Russia. We will return to whether that is plausible in a moment. For now, the question turns to whether nukes or NATO are feasible to secure the settlement, and, if not, what might be the best alternative. But first, it might help to ground things by pointing out that today's subject was a major news story. 80 separate outlets covered Zelensky's comments, with right-leaning sources more likely to publish what happened. Within those articles, centrist outlets portrayed Zelensky as issuing a serious ultimatum, while the right treated it as a calculated warning designed to force movement on the NATO front. All sides put the warning in the context of the failure of the Budapest Memorandum's assurances that Western countries would protect Ukrainian territory. How do I know this? Well, it is all thanks to our returning sponsor, Ground News. Not all news on the war gets this much coverage, and some stories do not even reach half of our political spheres. That is why Ground News has The Blind Spot, a feed dedicated to shining light on stories that one side of the spectrum overlooks. And good news from Ground News, everyone. For a limited time, my viewers get 50% off their unlimited access Vantage plan, exclusively through my link, ground.news/will. So head over to that link or scan the QR code to better inform yourself and support this channel. No ultimatum here, just valuable savings. Okay, the first option for Ukraine is NATO membership. You know the deal with this. NATO membership means that Ukraine would fall under the Article 5, an attack against one is an attack against all provision. And so any attempt by Russia to restart hostilities would be quickly met with a rapid influx of NATO firepower. The formal barrier standing in the way is a NATO policy to not admit countries with ongoing border disputes. You can apply, and Ukraine has, but you will not be accepted. They may give you a membership action plan, but that is still not the same thing as being in the club. The purpose of this rule is to not entangle NATO members into a new entrant's existing conflicts, reserving Article 5 as an insurance policy against anything new that may arise. In the context of the current war, one of the main explanations for why it started is that the rule created a perverse incentive for Russia to attack and thereby create a disqualifying conflict. And no, an armistice ending the war would not resolve the underlying conflict in the manner that NATO has in mind. In the context of that, Zelensky's NATO or Nukes proposal makes sense. Let's hop back in time to the era of Richard Nixon for a moment. Stop me if you have heard this one before, but a sitting Democratic president, fearing inevitable defeat, decides to bow out of the election, and a Republican who is tired of the United States subsidizing Allied defense spending wins and subsequently starts trying to clean house. Well, that was Tricky Dick in 1969 for you. Except the focus was not Europe. No, the Soviet Union was still around back then, and Nixon wanted to maintain a counterforce against it. Rather, he was more focused on partners in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Thus, he began floating the idea that they would soon be facing aid cuts. It became known as the Nixon Doctrine, or the Guam Doctrine for where it was announced. Almost collectively, those partners responded by telling Nixon, "Sure, we can defend ourselves. But do you know what would be a good way to do that? By building nuclear weapons." The United States was not a fan of the risks that came along with more nuclear weapons in the world, and so Nixon backtracked, providing military and economic concessions to avoid that outcome. Ukraine is basically trying to replicate that again in the 21st century. NATO may not like the risks associated with Ukrainian membership, but is that worse than Ukraine having nuclear weapons? I suspect that some NATO countries would find membership to be preferable, especially as you look eastward. Actually, some of them might not mind Ukraine having both. However, absent some serious changes in ally attitudes, it is a non-starter. Every single member of NATO has veto power over new entrants. So even if, say, the United Kingdom were on board, you still have Turkey and Hungary to get through, and to describe them as skeptics would be an understatement. Perhaps as a reflection of this, or perhaps because of their own hesitance, both the United States and Germany think that the West should just move on from the idea. Oddly, one thing that I am less skeptical of is Russia's willingness to go along with Ukrainian NATO membership. To be clear, Russia is not about to embrace the idea. I just mean that I do not think that Russia will certainly veto it, regardless of the circumstances. Now, clearly Russia's public declarations are adamantly against it, but the Kremlin says a lot of things that ultimately have no follow-through. As always, it is better not to listen to what leaders say, but rather watch what they do. Well, Russia did invade Ukraine, and that is why there is good reason to think that Russia might continue taking actions to block Ukraine's NATO bid. However, at the same time, the Kremlin barely blinked when Finland joined NATO, and that had a whole lot more border added to Russia's security environment, even as Russia complained of potential Ukrainian membership causing the same problem. Consequently, it is not impossible to imagine that one day a line will be drawn like this. Ukraine joins NATO as a part of the settlement, and Putin says, "What we meant is that we were uncomfortable with NATO being in Ukraine while all of these true Russians were under the thumb of Kyiv. But now that they have been liberated, it is no longer an issue." Now, would I bet on that happening? No, but again, the point here is that, by itself, Ukraine cannot join NATO because it is a part of Russia's public justification for the war is not a good argument. Just something to keep in the back of your mind. That takes us to the second half of Zelensky's proposal: nuclear weapons. You might get the notion that Ukraine could just roll out of bed one day and suddenly the nukes have magically appeared. But this is wrong. And I mean that it is so wrong that it is poisoning the intelligent conversation about it. I think where this is coming from is the equally wrong idea that Ukraine was previously a nuclear power. And thus we begin my twice annual video within a video tangent on what exactly happened there. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, something like 1,700 Soviet nuclear weapons were sitting on its soil. However, Soviet troops controlled them, and thus, in practice, Moscow controlled them. Ukraine never had physical possession over a nuclear weapons arsenal. Rather, the country was just in an awkward situation where the entity it was formerly a part of had a whole bunch of bombs still lying around on its soil. Now, you may be aware of the aforementioned Budapest Memorandum, which, on paper, exchanged the withdrawal of the weapons for security assurances from the United States and Russia, among other things. But pieces of paper can lie, and that is more or less what happened there. Ukraine's alternative option for the nuclear weapons was to try to take physical custody of them. Personally, I would not recommend attempting military action against a base that has nuclear weapons on it. At least not casually. Doing so might make a commander there a little trigger-happy if he worries that he might lose control over one of them. Meanwhile, many decades of economic mismanagement from Moscow meant that post-Soviet Ukraine was mostly a monetary mess. Ukraine needed some cash flow, and the United States liked the idea of the weapons going somewhere with better oversight. That is why Ukraine signed the deal, not because of the security assurances, because of money. In fact, the person primarily responsible for negotiating the deal, Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk, knew just how flimsy this piece of paper was, predicting immediately after its signature that if tomorrow Russia goes into Crimea, no one will even raise an eyebrow. It was purely a financial transaction, and, unfortunately for Kravchuk, he lived long enough to see his prediction come true, and then some. Okay, back to the main video. Even those who understand Ukraine's earlier relationship with nuclear weapons are often too optimistic about the timeline to development. Some of this comes from the perception that because Ukraine runs nuclear power plants, somehow that means that nuclear weapons can easily follow. Now, to be clear, Ukraine has the scientific and manufacturing capacity to produce a nuclear weapon, even though that is not saying much. Remember, North Korea built nuclear weapons, yet it looks like a colorless landmass at night, in contrast to the bright and bustling South. In fact, my own research estimates that dozens of countries have had the ability to build nuclear weapons for decades, but have not joined the actual nuclear club. Latent capacity and realized weapons are not the same thing. The barrier is that, at present, power plants or not, Ukraine does not have the existing infrastructure to fuel a nuclear bomb. Apologies, as it seems like this is a common thing that we have to talk about now. All you have to do is go back to the last video that I released. But there are two fuels that you can use for a nuclear weapon: Uranium-235 and Plutonium-239. Either process begins with raw Uranium-238, which comes out of the ground, and Ukraine has an abundance of. So far, so good. If you go the Uranium-235 route, you would want to spin the naturally occurring Uranium-238 in gas centrifuges. What comes out of the ground is less than 1% of the 235 isotope, and the centrifuges exploit the slight weight difference between the two isotopes to separate them. One slight problem for Ukraine, though: it does not have these centrifuges. Now, you might be asking yourself, wait a minute, I thought Ukraine had a bunch of nuclear power plants. They normally run on enriched uranium that comes from centrifuges. So how is any of this possible? Well, my hat is off to you for asking such a sophisticated question. But would you believe that it was Russia supplying Ukraine its enriched uranium up until 2022? Actually, that was a part of the whole Budapest Memorandum thing. And even through the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the Donbas Shadow War in 2014, the shipments still continued for 8 years. Then again, maybe it is not too crazy considering how Russia still runs gas through Ukrainian pipelines. Regardless, for approaching 3 years now, Ukraine has received fuel shipments from Canada. Actually, the outsiders producing enriched uranium is a centerpiece of the non-proliferation regime. Everything here is working as intended. Note that Ukraine could try to siphon off part of the Canadian fuel shipments for a bomb. For one thing, though, Canada would notice and not be pleased. But for another, the fuel for a power plant is between 3 to 5% uranium-235, while a bomb needs something closer to 90% purity. So Ukraine would still need to build those centrifuges. Again, all part of the non-proliferation regime at work. Now, if Ukraine could just import centrifuges from the United States, it would be no big deal. The whole thing could be up and running in under a year. But more than 30 years later, Washington is still in the business of non-proliferation. Consequently, that is not an option. As for going it alone, the tricky part for Ukraine is that gas centrifuges are extremely sensitive devices. They spin around faster than the speed of sound, so if they are even slightly imbalanced, they will fly off of their hinges and break everything in sight. Under normal conditions, and like Iran has done, a country would want to manufacture a small number of centrifuges and run a pilot program before doing anything else. This ensures that the scientists and manufacturers have mastered the process. Then you scale up to actually do the job. And that part can take a long time. Depending on the quality of the centrifuge, a whole facility might take a year to produce enough uranium for a single bomb. Judging by the pace of even experienced countries, the whole process might optimistically take 2 years to build facilities, test things, and then get an end product. Now, maybe Ukraine would want to cut some corners, skip the pilot program process, and assume everything will work the first time. Then maybe you can trim into that duration. Or maybe the initial designs will end up having a significant problem, and a whole bunch of money is wasted in the process. The alternative approach is to fuel a bomb with plutonium-239. Step 1 here is to create the plutonium by running uranium through a reactor. Ukraine already has the reactors to do this. Moreover, there are literal tons of reactor plutonium in the country. So far, so good. The problem here is that reactors do not just produce plutonium over here and radioactive waste over there. It is all mixed together. So yes, Ukraine has 7 tons of plutonium, but it would need to fish it out of the other 1,350 tons or so of waste. Therefore, Ukraine would need to build a reprocessing facility to isolate the material suited for a bomb. Unlike the enrichment route, though, this is not an industrial-heavy project, but it is a chemical process that would require significant time. Again, probably years, even if Ukraine may attempt to cut corners and hope to get lucky. I'm also hand-waving away problems with plutonium-240 being mixed in with the plutonium-239, which interferes with the chain reaction. Still, Ukraine would likely choose this pathway because one of the major steps, nuclear reactors creating plutonium, is already done. Moreover, plutonium weapons more efficiently convert their fissile material into blast yields. It is just that the process will not take mere months, contrary to the claims of a Ukrainian-based think tank interested in generating headlines. It will take years, and maybe more. Uranium or plutonium, the preceding discussion put Ukraine in a vacuum. In practice, Ukraine will have a hard time building a nuclear weapon without disruption. Remember, the purpose of proliferating is to shift the balance of power away from Russia. As such, the Kremlin would not look too kindly at that prospect. We have previously spent 90 minutes discussing how power shifts can cause negotiations to fail between parties. And you can bet that an opponent either at war or fresh off a war with Ukraine would want to say niet to a nuclear-level power shift about to happen. In fact, In the history of the world, only one country has ever produced a nuclear weapon in the middle of a war: the United States during World War II. And even then, the construction of Trinity had the benefit of two gigantic oceans of insulation. Actually, the United Kingdom offshored its program during the war, first to Canada and then to the United States, precisely because of this concern. Sure, Ukraine could take steps to make preventive action more difficult for Russia, like placing some facilities underground, as Iran has. But excavating those sites would just add time to the process, which runs contrary to this whole speedrunning plan. Never mind that Russia could also bomb the construction sites. There's the risk as well that the West could cut military aid in response, which is perhaps why Kyiv was quick to distance itself from that months-away report. Economic assistance should be a concern too. After India tested its Smiling Buddha peaceful nuclear device in 1974, Canada cut its civilian nuclear assistance to the country. And remember, Canada currently fuels Ukraine's nuclear power plants. This is where comparisons to Nixon end. The whole reason that these countries got concessions is because the United States believed that they would follow through on proliferating absent those concessions. But absent that credible threat, Nixon could have simply withdrawn from the region. So if nuclear weapons are not a realistic prospect, and that makes NATO membership a long shot as well, what is on the table? Well, all of this discussion is detracting from where the focus ought to be: conventional military aid and giving Russia a bout of war exhaustion. Conventional arms are useful because they do not come with the credibility problems that would otherwise arise with non-NATO commitments. Remember, the whole reason why NATO and Article 5 matter is because opposing countries believe that there will be follow-through on them. Vaguer ad hoc commitments from the United States, the United Kingdom, or France do little good if Russia does not believe that they will come to the rescue at the time of crisis. In contrast, arms given to Ukraine are things that Kyiv controls. Consequently, the Kremlin would not doubt that they would come into play. On the flip side of the coin, Ukraine would like to be in a position where, once the war ends, Russia will not soon want to restart hostilities. The fear that Russia would use any halt in fighting to reload is real. But whether the Kremlin will have the political ability to go again is by no means a historical certainty. After Russia demobilizes, restarting a war will require convincing the population to go along with it. And it turns out that it is considerably easier to keep the war machine going than it is to get it going again after it has come to a complete stop. Just think about the problems that came about in September 2022 with Russia's mobilization announcement, and then try applying it again after everyone had gotten comfortable with the idea of a post-war calm. After the Soviet Union left Afghanistan in the 1980s, Moscow did not spend the next few years rearming in an attempt to try again later. Rather, the costly operation caused the Kremlin to rethink its entire geopolitical strategy. And that happened despite there being far, far fewer casualties than what is happening in Ukraine. In another case, after World War II, the Truman administration was interested in shifting pressure from Germany and Japan to the Soviet Union. But the American public had grown exhausted of fighting and hammered the Democratic Party in the 1946 midterm elections. Truman only survived re-election in 1948 after retuning his foreign policy, and even then it did not look good until suddenly everything was fine. The problem for Kyiv is that the only way to make a population exhausted from war is to, well, fight a war. Now, I do not know how deep into a war Ukraine needs to go to make that work, and that means that Ukraine may want to continue fighting, even at territorial losses, until it has hit what it thinks is the right point. Meanwhile, now is the right point to tell you about a couple of wonderful books about the war. It is the end of the video after all. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. Oh, And did you know that I have a secondary channel now? Check it out. We have some great Q&A there from last week.